And I proposed to the director of the lab that we ought to have a modest program looking at the social and political aspects of potential global climate change. I made that proposal actually about 1985, so this is well before most people were even aware of the issue. Now, being a very good administrator, the lab director didn't just say, yes, Steve, have some money, go away, spend it on this slightly off-the-wall topic. He consulted wise men, and they were wise men, I'm afraid to say, not women, but he consulted the wise men on his advisory committee, one of whom was a former deputy administrator of the US Environmental Protection Agency, who stopped me in the corridor of the building I was working in and said, Steve, you're wasting your time with all this climate change stuff. It will never be a major public policy issue. I said, that's interesting, Milt. Why is that? He said, 3 reasons. It's too far in the future, the science is too uncertain, and there's no easy villain you can pin it on. And I said, that's very interesting, because I think that diagnosis is 100% correct, but the conclusion you draw from it is 180 degrees wrong. Climate change, I said, is like a Christmas tree. Everybody can hang their agenda on it. And indeed, I think as we look at what's happened with climate policy over the subsequent 2.5 decades, we see that's been the case. There are very clear, different agendas that converge or intersect around the climate change issue. One is the straightforward agenda of preserving the status quo environmentally, politically, developmentally, economically, from the impacts of global warming caused by anthropogenic greenhouse gas emissions. But there's another agenda, sometimes shared by people who have the first agenda, sometimes quite separate from those. And that is the agenda that seeks to use the carbon stick as a way of beating people into changing their behavior, because this constituency doesn't like the way people are behaving. They feel they are over-consuming, they don't like the consumer society, they don't like social inequality, and they feel that we can actually use the threat of climate change as a way of correcting all of these other social ills, which are very real social ills, that have proven to be quite resistant to other initiatives to bring about change. So it's the idea here, back to where I started, using nature not just as a way of justifying moral and political beliefs, but actually a way of coercing other people into changing their behavior to bring them into alignment with your own political beliefs. And a third agenda that we should never forget is that which seeks to use climate to promote particular technologies. The nuclear lobby in particular has seen climate change as a very pregnant opportunity for a revitalization of an industry that has been pretty moribund for 2 decades. There are other technology promoters, however, in the solar energy area in particular, who are also trying to promote their own favoured technology. So climate change isn't just about climate. It's about climate, but it's also about living right, living morally, and it's also about some very clear vested interests in particular technologies. One of the interesting aspects about our worldviews, which include all of these things that I've talked about so far, is that they tend to dominate when actually we have the least certain knowledge about a subject. This is a cartoon. It's produced by my colleague in Oxford, Jeremy Rovetz, philosopher of science, and a colleague of his, Silvio Funtowitz, who actually has worked for many years at the Joint Research Centres in Varese, not far from here. And what they seek to illustrate with this is that actually, as the systemic uncertainty about a problem rises, and or what is at stake becomes greater and greater, the more we fall back on our world views in our arguments. And you may have noticed actually that arguments tend to get more heated the less we actually know and the shakier the basis is for our arguments. And I think that's also a very helpful framework for us to keep in mind when discussing climate policy. Hierarchical organizations and institutions and actors, those people who cleave to the nature's perverse tolerant view, the ball in the landscape, will try to drive issues into the bottom left-hand corner towards the origin of this figure, so that they can be dealt with using routine decision tools, the kinds of things that bureaucracies, that government organizations, and so on and so forth, are very accustomed to implementing. On the other hand, those people who cleave to the idea that nature is ephemeral will try to drive as much of the climate change issue towards the top right as they possibly can in order that they can promote the kind of discourse about behavioural change that I've already described. And I think you can see that the market competitive kind of view probably wants to suck things into the middle, where the discretion and the expertise and the individual judgment of actors actually shapes policy. Point here is that science becomes the arbiter of truth when technocratic organizations and governments seek to resolve clashes in values by recourse to science. And it doesn't work. A classic example of this was the National Acid Rain Precipitation Assessment Program in the US. This was a program that was carried out throughout the 1980s, mandated by the Congress of the United States, produced masses of science, some of it very high quality, some of it rubbish, which was supposed to guide Congress in making a decision about how to deal with acid rain. And what it finally produced was a smorgasbord of science from which policymakers in Congress were then able to pick the bits that reinforced the views they had at the very beginning. So actually, more science doesn't necessarily help you sort out clashes in values. Science, I would argue, and this is exemplified by climate change, I think, is brilliant at showing us that there are potential problems. It's not very well placed to tell us what particular solutions out of a set of solutions that we should implement. That's the realm of politics. And unfortunately, what has happened over the years in the climate change arena is that we have not been willing to have the political debates about values, and we have pushed the issue back into a surrogate debate about the quality of science. It's been very curious to me, at least since 1992, as somebody who's followed the science very closely, at least since 1992, climate change science, flawed, provisional though it is, has been at least as good as the technical information upon which governments routinely base decisions about economic policy, employment policy, industrial policy, decisions to invade Middle Eastern countries, etc., etc. It's been at least as good as the information that companies regularly rely upon when considering mergers and acquisitions, new product launches, so on and so forth. That is to say, yes, it's flawed. Yes, there's lots of uncertainty. Yes, there's lots of things that need to be resolved. But actually, if it were not in the climate arena, we would have been acting on this information in 1992. But something was holding climate science to a platinum standard, a much higher standard than technical information has been held to in other arenas. And I would put it to you, it's because of what was seen as the political implication of accepting that science. Now, all of this is background for thinking about the approaching train wreck in Copenhagen. And I want to move on now to talk a little bit about the Kyoto architecture, because it was my belief that the Kyoto architecture, which is now 10 years old, was deeply flawed from the very beginning. I was once an anthropologist. I went on to anthropology after studying philosophy, because anthropology was much more interested in this connection between ideas about nature and moral and political preferences than philosophy was. So as an anthropologist, let me say, when I say that Kyoto was of immense symbolic importance, that's not trivial.